A woman in the Sophia stage, she wrote, has developed what can only be called her own philosophical center. She becomes, in the truest sense, her own guide. Think about what that actually means for a moment. And then think about a compass that used to rely on an external magnetic field to function. And then imagine that, slowly, it developed its own internal magnetism. It does not need the external field anymore. It still points somewhere. It just no longer needs to borrow that orientation from outside. Now here is something that almost nobody says out loud, and I want to say it carefully, because it matters. This shift can look from the outside like coldness, like withdrawal, like emotional unavailability. Men who encounter a woman in this stage will often say she is closed off, or too independent, or that she gives no opening. What they are actually sensing is the absence of a kind of emotional hunger they were accustomed to receiving from women, a hunger that made them feel needed, admired, essential. And its absence confuses them. When what they are encountering is not coldness, it is wholeness. There is a difference, and it is enormous. Marion Woodman, a Jungian analyst who wrote with extraordinary depth about women's psychology, described a phenomenon she called psychological prostitution. She was not using that term in any literal sense. What she meant was something far more familiar and far more subtle. She meant the way women learn to shape themselves, their opinions, their appetites, their voices, their very personality, to be palatable to the masculine gaze, to avoid taking up too much space, to soften their ambition, to swallow their anger, to perform a version of themselves that will be accepted, desired, approved of. This performance is so deeply conditioned that most women do not even recognize it as a performance. It simply feels like being yourself. But like being considerate or kind or easy to be with, but the body knows. There is a moment, and it comes differently for every woman, when the nervous system simply refuses to continue, not as a conscious decision, more like a biological mutiny. The body begins to feel something like nausea at the idea of shrinking again, of translating herself again into a language she does not actually speak, of being grateful for a kind of attention that required her to be less than she is. Woodman observed that this somatic refusal is not pathological. It is a signal of psychological integration. The woman's psyche has developed what she described as a structure that can no longer tolerate self-betrayal. Her internal system now registers inauthenticity as a physical threat. That strange tightness in the chest when she is about to say something she does not believe, and that tiredness that descends in conversations where she has to manage someone else's fragility instead of speaking her own truth. These are not symptoms. They are information. And here is the part that almost never gets said. This refusal, this tiredness, this quiet disappearance of the desire to perform, it does not mean she has become selfish. It means she has become real. There is something else that happens in this stage, something more intimate, and I think it deserves its own space here because it is one of the least understood aspects of what women in this position carry. In most relationships, women take on an invisible role. They become emotional translators. They name feelings that the other person cannot access. They track the emotional temperature of the room, of the relationship, of the other person's inner world, sometimes with a precision that borders on the supernatural. They teach empathy without being asked to. They hold space for someone else's growth as if it were a full-time occupation. This is not something women usually choose consciously. It emerges from cultural conditioning so old it barely registers as conditioning anymore. It simply feels like what love looks like, what care looks like, what Emma Jung, who was not only Carl Jung's wife, but an analyst in her own right, with her own body of work on the animus, described as the woman's function as mediator, the bridge between the unconscious and the conscious life of the people around her. The problem is not the function itself. The problem is what happens when it becomes one-sided, when a woman is doing the emotional translation work for the relationship year after year, and discovering that nothing is translating back, that she is doing the map making and the other person is content to follow the map without ever learning to read one.